Well, welcome back. We are here, still in the middle of the twisting and turning rail work stoppage in Canada, an unprecedented stoppage of both national rail lines and a story that keeps on going. As of yesterday, the federal minister ordered the Labor Relations Board to end the stoppage and the two parties into binding arbitration. And usually in the world of labor, that would be the end of the story, but it very much is not. To get to these details and more, we've got one of the best people in the country to talk about it, Derrick Hynes, who's the president and CEO of the association FETCO. Welcome, Derrick.
Hi, nice to be here, Scott. Thanks.
So, Derek, before we get into the specifics of this rail situation, which we will quickly, tell us a little bit about FETCO. I think probably not necessarily all of our listeners have heard of you before, and who you are and what you do during regular times.
Yeah, so we are a large employers association, and we represent organizations that exist within the federally regulated private sector. And if I can bore your listeners for 10 seconds about what that means, as you know, the Constitution divides what level of government regulates what industries. And the federal government within Canada regulates about 10% of the economy. Those are mainly the banking, transportation, and communications sectors. So my members are those large employers that are almost exclusively within the transportation and communication space. So what that means is within my membership are, Canada's major airlines, courier companies, marine ports, railways, telecom firms, and a few others. The Trucking Association is also in our membership, largely the transportation and communications firms. And what we try to do is represent those companies with one voice in Ottawa on a whole range of issues, but mainly around issues as it relates to the labor file.
So that's what you do in regular times. And I don't think that was boring at all, but maybe that's just because I work in a public policy association as well. And I think within that list of federally regulated companies, we do share a couple of members also. So that's what you do in regular times, but these are not regular times. And so, Derek, maybe I can ask you to just give us the backstory a little bit about how this now, what is a rail stoppage, sort of emerged on your radar, what you were hearing from your members, and then what brought you to send what I think was a somewhat unprecedented letter for your organization this Monday.
Yeah, most of my members are heavily unionized organizations, so they have decades of experience doing collective bargaining with their respective unions across the federal sector. And, that typically happens on its own. I have limited involvement or engagement in that process for good
Right.
reason. There's really no need for me to be involved. It's not my business. So it's quite rare for the association that I represent to get involved in any sort of level of bargaining. But we knew that coming into 2024, we were going to see some challenging bargaining happen across the federal sector for a couple of reasons. One, we went through COVID, and that was obviously a very challenging time for employers, for workers, for unions. And as the economy ramped back up, and we're now in the midst of an economy that's doing very well, we knew that there would be some challenging negotiations that would happen at the bargaining table, expecting that unions would come with some expectations for what they felt would be fair settlements. And at the same time, we knew that there was going to be very active bargaining in some important organizations and industries. Aviation, for example, we just saw WestJet. We know Air Canada's in the midst of bargaining with its pilots. Both major ports in Canada, in Montreal and Vancouver, are in the midst of some, important bargaining. We knew that these two railways were on a parallel track. And of course, Canada has two major freight railways, CN and CPKC. They are both my members, and their collective bargaining was happening basically at the same time. So we knew we were at risk of some potential downside in the event that this didn't work out, with a positive outcome before the deadline. And all signs have been, as these parties have been bargaining for many months now, that it's just not going well. And the parties, have shared that information publicly, particularly on the employer side, that times are really tough. Months of bargaining, not making much progress, clearly a big gap between the expectations of the union and the expectations of what the employer felt it could pay to find agreements. So, we were about a week out from what was going to be a work stoppage at both railways. And we, as an association, in consultations with my board, we realized we had to get engaged in some way. So, as you noted, last weekend, we sent a letter to the Minister of Labor outlining for him some options that we felt were at his disposal to avoid what we felt was going to be an economic catastrophe if both these railways went out on the same day.
Well, thanks for that backstory. One of the things that I thought was very interesting about your letter was it took the specific step of outlining kind of two main pathways, as I read it, that I think you suggested the minister could take, and then even going into some of the legal justification for why that might be both within the minister's power and advisable. Because I think it's relevant to what we've seen today, will you just walk us through what each of your recommendations were there?
Yeah, happy to do it. So, I mean, both the employers have publicly stated over the past few weeks that they would be willing to enter a process called, interest-based binding arbitration with their respective union to get a result, to get a collective agreement. Of course, what that means is a third party comes in, listens to the parties and the positions that they have, and then ultimately develops an agreement that is imposed upon the parties. So I think it's important to point out, because there has been some misperception out there that this is some employer friendly idea. It's not. I mean, binding arbitration, there's risk to both parties because you just simply do not know what the arbitrator might decide is the best outcome in these circumstances. So no party.
Both parties just largely have to live with that, like what the arbitrator decides is law.
Absolutely. So there's risk there, right? In a perfect world, I think both parties would prefer if they came to a negotiated settlement on their own and there were no outside parties assisting them. But when the employers went public with their voluntary acceptance that they would go into a process of binding arbitration, that to me sent a pretty clear signal to the market that this bargaining is not working. So, what we did in our letter was we suggested to the minister two paths that we felt he could pursue legally with his authority to get the parties to a process of binding arbitration and therefore avoid any work stoppage through a strike or lockout. So, option
Mhm.
A was for him to exercise his authority under Section 107 of the Canada Labour Code, which is a very broad power, which gives the minister authority to intervene in situations like this where he feels as though his only recourse to secure industrial peace is to intervene. And he can then direct the Canada Industrial Relations Board to refer this matter to a process of binding arbitration. And what we also said was he needs to be explicit and in that referral prohibit either of the parties in engaging in a work stoppage. So no strike or lockout. So that's option A. Option B, which would get us basically to the same outcome, is that the government would reconvene Parliament. They would craft back to work legislation that parliamentarians would then vote on. And presuming that that vote was successful, the outcome of that would be the same result, which is the parties would then be prohibited from strike or lockout and would enter a process of binding arbitration to get them to a collective agreement. So we argued to the minister that, from our sense, we were frankly agnostic as to which he chose, but we felt as though we were in a position where the government had to act. They had to do something. And these were two avenues that we felt were legal, and the minister and the government had the authority to take these actions.
The more extreme of those two options being the recall of parliament in kind of an emergency basis, because there's just a lot of machinery and mechanics that go into doing something like that.
Presumably that
I,
would be more challenging, yeah, because obviously Parliament's not in session, right? Everybody's back on their ridings for the summer, so it would be more difficult, not impossible, because there's lots of voting these days that is done virtually by parliamentarians, but it would likely be, from a mechanics perspective, a more difficult option. So we did provide another option, which was for the minister to pull this lever of Section 107 that is currently within his authority.
there's certainly some groups who feel that the minister does not have that authority under these circumstances to use Section 107 or have questioned it. We may see that questioned in court. Could you just play the devil's advocate? What's the argument from the other side?
I think the other side would argue that unions, that workers in Canada have an unfettered right to collective bargaining and an unfettered right to strike, and that the minister would not have any authority in any circumstance to overrule or, undermine that right. So that's their position. I would respectfully argue that it's not correct. And the reason why I would say that is, yes, the Supreme Court of Canada has ruled that there is a right to collective bargaining, there is a right to strike in Canada. That there's no argument there. But what we would argue is that right is not absolute. So Section 107 gives the minister expansive power and authority. It's not used very often, but it does
Mhm.
exist. And based on the advice I got from legal counsel, there is no case law that currently exists. There is no precedent that exists that would say the minister does not have that authority under 107 to do as we have just suggested him to do. Further to that
Mhm.
point, there was a case that just got decided in Ontario just this past summer as it relates to back to work legislation from a previous government with Canada Post. The judge there wasn't actually ruling on back to work because the situation was over and the decision was now moot. He did spend some time in his decision, fleshing this out a little. And he said two things. He said back to work legislation or an action like this, which would basically prohibit strike activity, can be done if a couple of thresholds are met. One, if the government or the minister believes as though the bargaining is truly at an impasse and there is no likelihood of a negotiated settlement. And two, if there is an interest based arbitration process provided to the parties so that there could be some fairness and an agreement could be reached. So even though the Supreme Court has ruled that, yes, right to strike does exist in Canada, we would argue it is not absolute. Now, I'm sure there are many who will argue the opposite, and we'll probably have that discussion further down the road when the dust settles from this dispute. But that would definitely be our position moving into that discussion or that dispute.
I think one of the things that's a bit interesting about the way that the situation played out is the minister did end up taking one of the recommendations that was contained within your letter, in particular around using Section 107. I think your letter would have indicated, and we were advocating this way too, many other Canadians were as well, probably for action in advance of any kind of work stoppage. It ended up coming within a number of hours after the work stoppage. And hearing you go through those justifications, I'm aware that part of the reason for that may have been the first of those two tests, the bargaining being sort of completely at an impasse.
I'm not in the minister's head, so I don't know what motivated the timing of his decision. I think your instinct is probably correct there. He may have found it more difficult for him to justify a preemptive action. I mean, he did state publicly the evening of the deadline that he believes the responsibility for getting this agreement rests with the parties, and he's going to leave it with them to work to that deadline to get that agreement. And then, it not having been successful, the next day he decided to intervene.
Yeah, Thursday. It's hard to keep track of the days. It's been a week that seemed like at least a month in Canadian sort of current events.
Indeed, yeah.
So that catches us up to approximately where we're at least at the time of recording this. And with the speed that things are changing, there could be more news by the time we're able to put it out, which we're going to try and do as soon as possible. So as I said off the top, eventually the minister ordered the parties into binding arbitration, and in all my labor experience, that is generally speaking the end of the story. But it's not the end of the story. As Canadians sort of roused themselves to read the news on Friday, August 23rd, they found out that this story has a few more twists and turns to it, and that in fact both of our nation's rail lines are not necessarily going to be operating regularly again. So, Derrick, would you just give us your take on and your just sort of description of the latest events?
Yeah, so the minister did give his direction to the Canada Industrial Relations Board last night. And of course, what he acknowledged in his news conference was that his authority is to direct the board to do something. And those are the things that we just talked about, right? And in his direction to the board, he directed them to take the parties through a process of binding arbitration. He directed the companies to get back to their operations. He directed the employees to go back to work. But what he did acknowledge was all of this requires a process at the Canada Industrial Relations Board and then a decision to realize his direction. So that's where we are. We're in the midst of that right now. It's a live process. I imagine meetings are happening right now at the board with the parties. And I imagine that the parties are putting forward some passionate perspectives on what they view to be the legalities of the minister's direction to the board. So we wait. I don't think trains are yet running. That would be the hope. But I think we have to go through this procedural process where the parties get to say their piece, and then the board will ultimately issue decisions in both cases.
A few interesting nuances that we're not always live to as average Canadians, that I guess, as you indicated in there, it's at least theoretically possible that the board wouldn't obey the directions of the minister, or wouldn't carry them out swiftly or something like that. Although I think they've been clear that that's their intent. So that one's sort of off the table, but it's at least an interesting theoretical possibility that you sort of highlighted when you said the minister's power is to direct the board. And then as well, yeah, the labor groups, they've indicated publicly that they don't necessarily feel like this is appropriate at this time, or that it's necessarily legal. So I think officially on Friday, one of our two major rail lines has got some people back at work, but strike notice has been served, and the other national rail line does not yet have people back at work. So still lots of question marks around kind of what's going to play out next.
Yeah, I mean, he acknowledged in his news conference that, this is an arm's length tribunal. He does not control the board. So in theory, the board could come back with a decision that is different from his direction. Though frankly, I would find that to be highly unexpected and unusual. On the employer side, we would believe strongly that the minister's authority under Section 107 can't be challenged by the board. But we do need to go through a process to get the decision that he basically directed them to come to.
The most difficult part of this conversation, I'll ask you to use your crystal ball, Derrick. How would you expect things to play out in the next couple of weeks? What would you advise Canadians to be ready for?
Well, I'm going to be hopeful that we're going to get decisions forthwith, perhaps today, at least interim decisions, so that the legal direction will be given to the parties to get back to work. So if that does unfold today, then we should see these companies ramp their operations back up. I don't think they're going to flip a switch and we'll be back to full operation, but there'll be a process, I presume, of a few days to get to that point. Anything different from that, I think, would be unusual and unexpected. I do know there are going to be parties who are not happy with this direction, and there will be likely a process that will follow when these decisions are challenged and are appealed. But I don't think that that should slow the process of getting these critical companies back to work.
So, Derek, we spent a lot of time talking about a specific labor dispute here, when even you said in the opening, you rarely intervene in specific labor disputes. So let's zoom out to the macro for a moment. My question is going to be, what, if anything, do you think has to change in the way that we approach these as a country, sort of in terms of legislation? Is there anything that you're recommending to the federal government? Part of why I asked that question is, by my count, this is probably about the fourth disruption of our rail lines we've seen in the last 5 years for various reasons, some of those being port disruptions and such. From the zoomed out perspective, do you think we need to be handling these federally regulated, highly concentrated industries any differently?
I think that's a conversation that we need to have. We did see critical work stoppage on the West Coast ports last summer. Now we have this short railway disruption. There's some critical bargaining happening at Canada's largest airline, which will unfold in the coming months, and same with the Montreal port. These are critical industries that provide services to Canadians. And in the context of the railways, I mean, the stats that are flowing out are just kind of mind boggling, right? We're talking about $1 billion worth of freight each day on these two major railways. So you would be hard pressed to find a Canadian who will not be affected by a simultaneous work stoppage at both of Canada's major railways. So, yes, we need to have this conversation. I mean, it's under Part 1 of the Canada Labor Code, all the processes and procedures that guide the bargaining between the parties, and what we need to do when we get into situations like this where we're at impasses that have such catastrophic impacts on Canadians. That is a conversation we need to have. These are industries of critical national importance. We're talking about national economic security here. So we would certainly be open to that discussion, cracking open Part 1 of the code and trying to find ways where we can resolve our differences, still allow a process where there is fundamental collective bargaining that occurs, but find ways of getting through these really challenging situations where the gap between the parties is so large that resolution can't be found and we run the risk of shutting down the economy. I mean, I think that's an outcome that everybody would agree is unacceptable, and we need to find a better way of getting through it.
Are you willing to take that even one step farther and suggest, have you considered what any of those ways might be?
We haven't. I mean, people throw around lots of terms like essential services, though I think that that concept is largely misunderstood around what it means. So, what I do think we need to do, and I think we need to do this in a tripartite way where government, unions, employers, we all come together with open minds and we try and find a way to sort through this such that the right to collective bargaining is preserved, but that we do not give any one party the power to inflict the kind of economic damage that something like this, these sort of stoppages could cause. It's not an easy conversation, but an unfettered, unchecked right to strike will continue to give us these sorts of outcomes. And I think Canadians will agree that that's unacceptable.
It also seems to me like one simple change would be just to not line up the contract negotiations in the way that we did, through a variety of federal government decisions this time around, which I think made this situation even more likely to take place. It seems like a relatively straightforward change, though.
Yeah, well, sometimes we get these coincidental outcomes, right? Where important organizations end up lining up at the same time, and the results can be consequential for sure.
Well, Derrick, thank you very much for your time today and for walking us through this unprecedented issue resulting in your organization taking some pretty unique steps here. And we're still in the middle of the story, so we'll pick it back up again as it continues to unfold. Let's hope for a speedy outcome that delivers good outcome for the workers, good outcome for Canadians, and keeps our trains moving.
Agreed. Pleasure to be with you. Thanks for inviting me.
Thanks for joining us today, and if you found this episode interesting or insightful, let us know by heading to Apple Podcasts or Spotify and giving us a quick review and a rating, or tell a friend about the show.